All right, chapter 1. Everyone's an author. Introduction to rhetoric, the power of language and persuasion. One of the most powerful tools for persuasion is language. When words fail, people often resort to violence or force. But it's through language and rhetoric that we engage in negotiation, debate, and compromise. This is why mastering the art of rhetorical thinking is essential, not just for writing or for public speaking, but for navigating everyday life and decision making. What does it mean to think rhetorically? Thinking rhetorically means developing certain habits of mind that start with listening and seeking to understand before jumping to conclusions. It also requires being reflective about your own beliefs and motivations before you try to persuade others to accept your viewpoint. The first step, listen. The foundation of rhetorical thinking is being open to the words and perspective of others before you make a judgment or a firm opinion. You need to actively listen and try to understand what others are saying. Rhetorical listening means opening yourself to the viewpoints of others, fully taking in their words and thoughts, acknowledging the value in the other people's ideas, even when they're vastly different from your own. It's not just about hearing words, it's about engagement. This means taking the time to digest what's being said, considering why someone holds a certain viewpoint, and being open to the possibility that their perspective is valid, even if it challenges your own beliefs. Step 2, take the time to understand. Before rushing to conclusions, take a step back. Ask yourself, why is this person saying what they're saying? What is the larger context in which their argument is being made? And what factors might be influencing their point of view? Successful arguments consider counter-arguments and weigh different perspectives. It's important not to dismiss opposing viewpoints out of hand, but instead fully grasp them before responding. Step 3, examine your own thinking. It's also important to reflect on your own stance. Why do you think the way you do about a particular issue? What experiences, beliefs, or biases shape your opinion? This process of self-scrutiny can either reinforce your beliefs or open you up to new ways of thinking. Either way, the goal is clarity. Step 4, do your homework. Being a rhetorical thinker means doing your research. You need to 1, gather information on your topic, 2, analyze what you found, and 3, synthesize your findings into well-informed conclusions. It's essential that your ideas are informed and backed by credible sources. This is how you build strong, persuasive arguments. We've talked a lot about that this semester already. Rhetorical strategies and appeals. When evaluating someone else's writing or speaking, ask yourself the following. 1, tone. What tone is the writer or speaker using? Is it formal, casual, or somewhere in between? I typically think about this that most of what we're going to read is formal, right? I don't know if you guys have a different opinion, but I find most of what we read to be pretty formal stuff, especially if you're reading articles online, articles about things, then it's written in a formal tone. I think that you'd find maybe a more casual tone if you're reading like a book or something of that nature is more casual, and you could start looking at it more casually there, but mostly I think that we're talking formal, right? Especially in class like this. Inclusivity. Are they using language that draws the audience in or makes them feel excluded? Again, I would say mostly for what you're going to be reading for this class or just in general, it's going to be inclusive language, right? They want people to read their articles. People want to get the clicks on the internet, right? Which means you're going to be reading inclusive articles, language that people can understand and read easily. That's the goal, right? Facts versus opinions. Are they examples? Are the examples they provide factual, or are they making unverified claims? Again, this is something that facts versus opinions can be difficult. Again, think back to our misinformation lessons of the past, right? Where it can be pretty difficult to determine what is fake and what is real. So sometimes you have to do some double checking. There's a lot of opinions out there versus facts, right? And then credibility. Are their sources reliable, or are they using questionable evidence? Understanding these rhetorical strategies will help you become a more discernible reader, writer, and thinker. Why rhetorically thinking matters to you. I think this is something that we all do all the time. We just don't think of it in this sense, right? And I think we got some good examples here of why. Whether you're buying a new computer, deciding on a job, choosing a major, or thinking about graduate school, rhetorical thinking plays a huge role in your life. It's about doing research, being open-minded, making ethical, well-informed decisions, I'd argue most people don't just jump into things, right? You're doing research about things. Imagine if you're going to go buy a new car, you probably have done some research on that before, right? You don't just go buy something. You want to do some looking up, right? You want to read articles about things to understand what you're going to jump into, right? You're not just going to go out and buy something without doing the research beforehand, right? So this is something we do all the time. We just don't call it rhetorical thinking. Making ethical, well-informed decisions, especially when making purchases, right? Again, cars, whatever, big purchases. Nobody wants to just buy these things. You got to do some research, at least in my opinion. And it can be fun to do research in that regard, right? It's like, oh, do I want this one? Maybe I want this one. I just bought a new chair recently. I had to do quite a bit of research for that, right? Had to figure out which one I really wanted. Credit where it's due. Always acknowledge the work and contributions of others in your arguments and discussions. This is not only ethical, but builds your credibility. Again, plagiarism can be a very serious thing, so you always want to give people credit. The role of imagination in rhetorical thinking. Be creative. Sometimes a little imagination can open up new ideas or approaches to a topic. It can also help you engage your audience in unique, meaningful ways. Engaging with your audience, putting it in your oar. When thinking rhetorically, always consider 1, how do you want to come across to your audience? Do you want to seem approachable, authoritative, neutral? 2, how can you represent yourself as knowledgeable and credible? This involves showing you've done your research and understand the topic. 3, how can you show respect for your audience and those whose ideas you engage with? Acknowledge differing viewpoints with respect, even when you disagree. And 4, how can you demonstrate that you have your audience's best interest at heart? Understand what your audience needs and make sure your argument addresses those needs. Rhetorical thinking isn't just about winning arguments. It's about learning to listen, understand, and engage thoughtfully with others. It's about becoming an ethical communicator and making well-informed decisions in life. Whether you're writing a paper, having a debate, or making a major life choice, thinking rhetorically will help you navigate complex situations with wisdom and confidence. All right, chapter 16, just the information. Introduction to reports. Reports have played an important role in your life, even if you haven't noticed. Think about all the reports you've received throughout your life. For example, report cards, SAT scores, medical checkup reports. What reports do? Reports typically include just the facts. They don't include personal opinions or emotions. IMRAD structure of reports, the key structure, introduction. M, methods. R, results. And D, discussion. Questions to consider. Where have you seen the IMRAD structure in reports you've come across? Again, this is just a structure in which they're going to write reports. This just means mostly I talk about 5-paragraph essays in here a lot. So this 5-paragraph essay would have like an introduction, and then in their next paragraph they would talk about the methods they used for this report. Then they would talk about the results they got, and then they would talk about a discussion of those results between the methods, the results, and what answers they came up with. And then the last one would be a conclusion, right? And that would be the 5-paragraph. So when we're talking about reports, this is the structure people are going to use to write a report. Reports across media and genre. Reports in different media. What do reports look like in various media, such as written text, online platform, or video formats? Reports across genre. How do reports differ depending on the genre, such as a scientific report or a news report? I'd say it's important to keep in mind there that a news report might be a lot of opinion, right? It might not be a lot of fact, whereas a scientific report is going to be mostly facts, right? It's not going to be a lot of opinions. There's going to be a lot of data and numbers, probably charts. Characteristic features of effective reports. Key features. Topic, carefully focused for a specific audience. What is the topic? Who is the report for? Definitions of key terms. Why is it important to define technical terms even for audiences who already may know them? And then trustworthy information. The importance of presenting accurate, verifiable information. Documentation. Why do reports include citations? Effective organization and design. How is the information presented? Does a report include visuals? And then confident, informative tone. Reports often convey information, not arguments. However, how can a report maintain objectivity? I would say a report, in this case, maintains objectivity by showing more statistics and facts, right? More charts and data than just my opinion about things. Let's go back to some of these and talk. We can use the TED Talk as an example here. Always for what is the topic and who is the report for. For a TED Talk, like the topic could be anything, right? Almost anything. There's so many different ones between social science and actual science. Who is the report for? Typically, I feel like those reports are for experts, but they can also just be for people like us, right? People that want to learn more about a subject from an expert, which is why they bring these people out. Why is it important to define technical terms, even for audiences who may already know them? I feel like you may know terms and you may think that you know technical terms, but some people may have a slightly different definition than yourself, right? So I think it is very important to define some of these terms before you start talking about them. Trustworthy information, the importance of presenting accurate, verifiable information. TED Talks, you don't get there by not being a trustworthy source of information, I'd argue. And then again, why do reports include citations? Because they've got to show where they've done their research. These are not just opinions, right? This is actual facts and statistics. Effective organization and design. How is the information presented? For a TED Talk, it's presented via a speech, right? They give speeches in large rooms. And do the reports include visuals? TED Talks sometimes include visuals. I don't always see them on there. Sometimes they are just purely somebody speaking, right? But sometimes they do include the stats and statistics, and they have a slideshow in the background. Discussion of bias and tone in reporting. Avoiding confirmation bias. Review the importance of presenting information clearly and objectively without letting personal bias influence the facts. This can be really difficult. We all have personal biases. We can't help it, and that's just the way it is. But sometimes you have to take a step back, right, and really look at things and see if you have a bias about the information and what your bias says about that. Pay attention to the subtle clues that word choice gives about your stance. Again, I brought this up several weeks ago, but I always remember things that I don't agree with a lot better than things I do agree with, and that could go into word choice, right? If there's word choice you really don't agree with, it's easy to pay more attention to those subtle clues. Profiles and reports. What is a profile? It's a first-hand account of people, places, events, or institutions. Key features of profiles. First-hand knowledge. How did you gain insight into the subject of the profile? What research did you do over the person to write this paper, right? Detailed information. Include background information, sensory details, sights, sounds, smells, and anecdotes. And then an interesting angle. Present a profile from a fresh or surprising perspective. Again, we're talking about a profile. You might be talking about a specific person, right? Or a specific place or institution and how they run and operate. Reporting information, a roadmap. Choose the topic. 1, select your topic. Why does this topic matter to you and others? 2, if assigned a topic, how can you find an interesting angle and focus on a narrow aspect of it? Consider your rhetorical situation. 1, audience. Who are you writing your report for? What do you know about them? 2, purpose. What's your purpose for writing the report? And then research and organization. Research. Begin by assessing what you know and don't know about your topic. Generate questions about your topic. Try to figure out what you want to learn more of, right? Narrow your focus. Why should you narrow down your topic to make it more manageable? And then organizing your information. You can have descriptions, definition, analysis, and examples, or chronological or spatial organization. We talked a little bit about this a couple weeks ago, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in another class. But here we're talking about chronological information is information in time, right? Whereas spatial organization, the good example I remember is planets in space, right? You would talk about Earth and then you'd talk about Mars. You wouldn't want to talk about Earth and then like Jupiter. You'd talk about them in order of space, right? Not in order of time. Writing a tentative thesis. What is the central idea or argument of the report? 2, introduction. How can you get your audience interested in the topic? In conclusion, what do you want your audience to take away from the report? It's very important, right? What do you want people to know about the research you've done? Your most important things that you learned, right? Then we've got revising and refining. Look critically at your draft. Does the opening capture interest? Could the report begin differently to engage the audience? Is the topic clear and focused? Is there a clear thesis? Is the tone confident? How can the report avoid sounding argumentative? And then, do you include any visuals in the report to help support your written text? Final reflection, reflecting on the report. How well did the report communicate the information? What revisions could improve the report? I statements in academic writing. What are I statements in writing? I statements are sentences where the author refers to themselves directly using the first person pronoun I. Examples: I believe that, I think, in my opinion. I researched this topic because. Common uses of I statements in everyday writing. Personal essays, blogs, opinion pieces, and informal writing often rely on I statements. Students may already be familiar with using I statements in personal reflections, social media posts, or casual conversations. There's traditional views on I statements in academic writing. The historical approach to academic writing. In the past, academic writing was expected to be objective and impersonal. Writers were discouraged from using I because it was seen as subjective, informal, and less authoritative. The belief was that academic writing should focus on research, facts, and data, not personal opinions or experiences. The idea of objectivity in academic writing. Academic writing aimed to present information without personal bias. The use of third-person perspective was encouraged to make writing feel more formal and detached. For example, instead of saying, I believe this is an important issue, students would write, this is an important issue. Now, however, I learned this last year. The role of I statements in modern academic writing, there's been a shift toward personal voice in writing. Over time, the rules around using I in academic writing have become more flexible. Many instructors now recognize the value of students developing a personal voice in their writing. Certain fields like the humanities, social sciences, and reflective writing now often welcome the use of I statements. When is it appropriate to use I statements in academic writing? Reflective essays. Students may use I to share their personal experiences or insights. Argumentative writing. Writers may use I to clarify their stance or position on a subject, especially in opinion-based essays. Introducing the research process. Writers may use I to explain how they conducted research. For example, I examined several scholarly articles on this topic and found blank, justifying a choice. In more subjective assignments, students can explain why they chose a particular topic or method of analysis. However, I statements should be limited in formal research papers unless specifically required. How I statements can weaken your writing. They're vague and subjective. Overusing I statements can make writing feel more opinionated and less objective. For example, an example of vague writing: I think that climate change is a big problem. Revision. Research shows that climate change possesses significant environmental challenges. Undermining authority. Using I too often can make your arguments sound less confident or too personal. For example, I feel like the solution might work. A stronger revision. This solution is effective because research demonstrates. And then you got redundancy and necessary focus on the writer. In academic writing, the focus should be on the topic, not the writer. For example, in my opinion, I believe that. For revision's sake, simply state the opinion. This argument is convincing because. Too much focus on personal experience. Academic writing is often about contributing to a larger conversation with research, not just sharing personal stories or beliefs. Personal experiences should not replace strong evidence or research-based arguments. How I statements can strengthen writing. Clarity and ownership. Using I strategically can make it clear that the ideas or opinions expressed are yours. For example, in this essay, I argue that. Emphasizing your perspective or approach. When discussing your own methodology or findings, I can emphasize that the perspective comes directly from the writer. For example, I developed this framework based on my analysis of primary sources. Establishing credibility through personal insight. In some cases, personal experience can add value to an argument, especially in reflective writing or qualitative research. For example, having worked in healthcare for several years, I observe how this policy affects patients directly. And then engagement and reader connection. Using I occasionally can make the writing feel more direct and engaging, especially when explaining thought processes on personal research. Example, I chose to explore this topic because of its relevance in today's educational system. I really don't mind the number 3 here, where you're establishing credibility through personal insight. In past years, I've had people who've worked many years in healthcare fields, and because of that, when they use these I statements in their essays talking about healthcare reform or whatnot, that it's difficult for me to be like, oh, that's wrong. You can't make I statements here, that I don't find necessarily to be totally wrong, because this is their opinion. This is information that they knew, and there's no real way to like quantify that without saying like, this is what I saw, right? This is my opinion about things. So again, I like, for me, the number 3 is probably the best of these. Striking the right balance when and how to use I effectively. Use I sparingly. It's important to use I when necessary, but avoid over-reliance on it. Example, in scientific writing, avoid I unless you're discussing the specific methods you use. Focus on the argument, even when using I. The central focus should remain on the subject or argument itself, not the writer. For example, I argue that educational reform is essential based on the following evidence. Avoid over-personalization. Avoid making your entire essay a personal reflection unless that's the point of the assignment. For example, instead of I feel that, focus on the evidence by writing. Research suggests that. Develop a professional tone. Even when using I, the language should remain formal and professional. Maintain an academic tone. For example, I conducted interviews with local businesses rather than I talked to a few shop owners. Tips for revising writing to minimize I statements. Revise sentences for directness. Instead of I believe that the data shows a trend, write the data shows a trend. Remove unnecessary personal phrases. If the sentence works without I, remove it. For example, I think that the novel explores the theme of isolation. The novel explores the theme of isolation. Focus on evidence, not the writer. Ensure that the supporting points are based on research, not just personal opinion. For example, instead of I feel that smoking bans are important, focus on the evidence. Smoking bans are shown to reduce public health risks. Conclusion, the role of I in academic writing. The use of I in academic writing is not strictly prohibited, but it requires balance. It can help clarify personal perspective approaches, but should be used carefully to avoid weakening the argument. Be mindful of your I statements. Focus on making your writing clear, professional, and evidence-based. Know when and how to use I in your essays, and this will help you develop a strong and authoritative academic voice.